I am Laurie, and I'm a associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine. I also have an appointment in the School of Information. So I teach over there and I have lots of collaborators over there as well. And I'm going to talk to you today about successfully navigating third-party developer relationships. And Rima, who many of you know, is kind of my partner in crime in a lot of stuff. So don't be surprised if I call on her to help fill in gaps and poke holes in the things that I'm forgetting to tell you about. So she and I do quite a bit of work together. And I will start off by saying this is really informal. This is more of a conversation. Feel free to interrupt. Um, I don't have any like amazing earth-shattering evidence to bring to you today. More so, this is based like a talk based on my experiences over the last 20 years developing digital health technologies and interventions and working in this space. So again, this is super informal and feel free to interrupt, feel free to interject, and let's have a conversation. So again, who am I? I mentioned that I am a faculty member in the Department of Family Medicine. I'm a social scientist by training, and I have spent the last 20 plus years in digital health. I started my work with internet mediated interventions on the internet, like just web-based internet stuff. And I transitioned over to clinical telemedicine, mobile health, more holistic digital health. Like if just name it, I've done it. If I haven't done the research myself, I've evaluated grants on sensors, and I've done a lot of sensor-based grant work in terms of reviewing and consulting. I am an interventionist is how I would consider my research to be. So I develop, implement, and evaluate interventions. Most of these interventions are behavior change interventions for chronic disease self-management. And much of my work is also focused with a health equity lens. So lots of experience working with these types of interventions in populations where people often say to me, are you nuts? Why are you doing it with this group of people? So we do a lot of work in inner city Detroit. I have lots of work in Flint and in other communities where people often talk about the digital divide. I mentioned that I've got like 20 plus years experience developing these digital health interventions. Like I mentioned, I've done web-based stuff, text message interventions, mobile apps, where I have a lot of work with wearables and with peripheral devices like blood pressure cuffs, scales, CGMs. You know, I don't want to say I've done everything because I'm sure I haven't, but I've done a lot of different types of mobile health work over the years. And again, I've worked with vendors in a lot of these different regards. So, my purpose for today is again to talk about successfully navigating third-party developer relationships. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on a series of papers that Rima and I have been developing. And it's really shameful that they've not been out published in the literature yet. But you know how the writing life cycle is. We tend to go in fits and spurts. So we have a series of 4 or 5 papers that is really focused on this topic of working with vendors. And we're going to come to today's talk with this assumption that if you are here listening today, you've probably already made the decision on what it is you want to build for the most part. You may not be exactly sure about what it is you want, but you've got a good idea. You probably also have made the decision that you don't have the skills to do it yourself. Possibly you don't have the skills to have somebody else like in-house do it for you. But again, this is really focused on third-party relationships. We've also made the assumption that you're not going to hire someone or that you are going to hire someone else to do it, as opposed to just like hiring a student to help develop something. And the other assumption that we're going to make is that you may or may not already have money in hand. So maybe you've written the grant, but it's not been funded yet, or maybe you have been funded, but you haven't started yet. So like we don't really make a delineation as to whether you've got the money and you're ready to spend, because I've got some points to talk about in both regards. Oh, I lost myself. Let me get back in. There we go. So we cannot possibly cover everything that I would like to talk to you about in an hour. It's just not feasible. Like I said, Rima and I have about 4 or 5 papers on these topics. And so when trying to figure out how to best talk to you today, my decision was that I would like to share with you some lessons learned of things that I wish everybody would know when it comes to working with developers. And then we're going to resort to kind of a choose your own adventure. I have a bunch of different mini topics that are prepared to talk about, and I would like to hit on those based on what it is you want to hear about. So I hope that sounds like a good plan for everyone. And quick question. If I escape out of this, no, that's not going to work. Never mind. If there are questions, Victoria or Rima, can one of you just like shout out and tell me? Because I can't see what's going on.
Will do.
Oops. Sorry, I'm just futzing around here. I don't know what I'm doing. There we go. So that's our agenda for today. Any questions before we get started? And just speak up if you do, because I can't see any of you. Okay, so let's just start with some lessons learned. And these are in no particular order. They're not particularly sequenced, or one's not more important than another. It's just these are some things that I wish everybody who was working with third-party external vendors knew about. And this list is not exhaustive. These were just the major lessons that really came to mind. And the first is that building a strong team is so, so, so important. And not only like knowing what your team does, but knowing what your team doesn't do and doesn't know is super important. So, what I mean by that is, when we're building an intervention or we're building a technology or a piece of software, and it's going to be like for research purposes, we typically have a team that we've assembled of scientific experts. But knowing what your team knows versus what your team doesn't know is super, super important, because if you don't know where your weak spots or your blind spots are, it can be hard to fill in the gaps. And one of those things that's really important to know right up front is whether or not your team has experience working with a vendor before or developing a piece of technology, because there's a certain skill set that you learn when you are developing a product for the first time. And when you don't have that expertise reflected on your team, you don't know what you don't know. So, again, putting together a team that has this kind of expertise is really important. And even from a grant writing perspective, I can tell you one of the first things I do when I'm evaluating someone's research team in a grant is I look at their personnel and I look to see, does anybody on the team have experience working with a vendor? Because if you don't have an established vendor relationship and you don't have someone who's ever built something before, I can already tell that the feasibility of your project is going to be somewhat compromised, because that's like mission critical. So you will be evaluated by people like me for whether you have that expertise on your grant or not. So just keep that in mind. Another thing that I like to point out is that your team members, like we often write grants with team members in mind for who's going to help us get the grant. But from a feasibility perspective, you don't just want someone's name on your grant. You do actually need their expertise. So when you're thinking about who's going to be on your project teams, make sure you're not just picking people who have name recognition only with no intention of working on your project. So we know that senior, well-known people often have very limited time, but you truly need their time and attention for the things that are relevant to their expertise, because all science decisions, or let me rephrase that, all development decisions that you make when you're building a piece of technology, They should be science driven. So if you've got team members that are not really invested in your work and helping you to build your product, you're not going to be able to make those right science driven decisions. So be thoughtful and intentional about who you put on your teams. Are there any questions about teams before I move on to the next lesson? Okay. My next lesson or that I've learned is don't go it alone. So just like you don't want to build a team full of people that are not going to actually functionally help you, if you do that, which like I would not criticize anybody for doing it, that's how we often as junior researchers get grants funded. We find the biggest names we can with the biggest name recognition. But when you try to do that, you end up going it alone, and that's not how you build good products. So again, you don't know what you don't know. And not only do you need to have that expertise on your team, but it also applies to what's going on around you in your context and in your environment. And so, if you're going to try to go it alone and build some type of mobile intervention without talking to the right people on campus, you're setting yourself up for heartache. And like this group here is amazing for figuring out what you don't know. So, if you're looking to build something, come talk to the people at Metric. Talk to other people on campus about contracting. Talk to the experts that are going to need to be in your corner through all of the different steps. Because I guarantee if you try to figure it all out on your own, you won't be doing things right. You're going to be causing delays. You're going to be causing probably more cost. It's just a real, it's a real misstep to not explore the resources that are available to you. And had Metric been around when I started my career, oh my goodness, the amount of things I could have avoided, it's I can't even begin to imagine what my career could have been like 15, 20 years ago. So lean on your colleagues, lean on your resources, and have people help you figure out the things that you don't know because there's a lot to learn in this space. Any questions on that point before I move on? Okay. My next point is be flexible. And like we've all heard the quote from Robert Burns about the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. 100%. Anything I have ever done in the digital health space has gone awry in some capacity or another. And a lot can happen during our research timelines. If you think about building a piece of technology that starts from the grant writing process all the way through to the end of a clinical trial, we're talking about a project that could be easily 10 years in the making. And a lot of stuff can happen during those 10 years. Rima and I have had lots of terrible things happen to us in the middle of our projects. Things ranging from vendors going out of business, technology changes that break all of your peripheral devices, prices change, prices rise. Like during COVID, development costs skyrocketed because of the amount of money that it was taking to hire developers. And so figuring out how to make sure you have the funds available to do what you need to do, there's just a lot of things that can happen in that regard. And being nimble and being flexible and being able to see all of the different avenues that are ahead of you and to make the most appropriate choice down any one path, but being ready to hop to other paths as necessary is really important in this line of work. Another important lesson that I've learned is understand who vendors are. And I don't mean this slide to be antagonistic to developers because it's not intended to be that way. But understand these relationships that you're entering into because your third party developer, they are somebody who is working with you. They are providing a service to you. They are not a part of your team. And I don't mean that to be very adversarial, but it's just an exercise to say they are someone that you are hiring. And it is wonderful to have good relationships with them where you can be collaborative and supportive of one another. But at the end of the day, they work for a company that has a very different set of requirements and um, goals for what it is they're doing. So we like to have vendors that operate with our team very well, but don't lose sight of the fact that they are not part of the project team. Because if you get too comfortable with your vendors, when it comes time for actual business, it can be really hard and uncomfortable to operate in a business relationship. So just be mindful of those roles and the responsibilities of the vendor versus your team. And when I say again, they're not your friend, that I don't mean that to be adversarial, but when you really think about the fact that they are representing a business and their goal is to make money, yes, have a good relationship with your vendor, but don't misunderstand and misinterpret the relationship. Because again, once you do, things can go south really easily. Another thing about understanding who vendors are is that they know their business, but you know yours. And I talked on a prior slide about how you're going to make millions of decisions when it comes time to developing software or an intervention. And there are some decisions that your vendor is very well qualified to weigh in on. But there are some decisions that truly are scientifically driven by your science. So when you're going to your vendor for help and collaborating on developing something, just know what their expertise is in versus what your expertise is in. That'll make things go a lot easier. And again, remember, they work for a business. They're looking to make money, not necessarily to further science. So if there's something that you want to build into your intervention or your software, some function or feature that really is motivated by the science, be clear about that and be able to communicate your science to the developer so that they can also communicate back their concerns about the things that they know very well, like working with people, usability, user experience, things in those domains. Are there questions on any of those slides before I move on? Okay. Budgeting is a huge topic to talk about. And some of the lessons that we've learned over the years is that a budget is just a series of educated guesses. And we know this. But at the same time, we also don't know it when it comes time to developing. And we have to keep in mind that sometimes our budgets aren't going to be what we need for a variety of reasons. Budgets can be cut. Like, for example, Rima and I are working on a project right now that's funded through NCI, the National Cancer Institute. We knew going in that if we got awarded that grant, our budget was going to take a major hit. And it did. We lost 17% off the top for all years. And that's like in a good year, we only lose 17%. You could lose more. So know that the budgets can be cut, know that prices can change, know that development costs can rise, personnel can shift, and project needs can shift. And if you're not planning for additional development dollars over the course of your project, you may be in for a world of hurt because again, the state of the world can change around you. There can be product updates to operating systems that your interventions run on, and that can break everything. And if you don't have money allocated to maintain and fix and move forward when things around you shift, again, you might be in for a world of hurt. So if budgeting is something you're interested in talking about, that's one of my like choose your own adventure points in just a minute. Contracting is something that is so scary to so many people, but contracting is absolutely and utterly beneficial. Good contracts protect both parties. They are there to protect you and they are there to protect your vendor. And so people often get very antsy when it comes time to contracting because we start to feel a little adversarial. And I think that's natural and to be expected. But remember, everything that you want protects you, and everything your vendor wants protects them. And if you can be mindful about why they feel they need to be protected from you, and you can be open about why you need to be protected from them, it can be a much better situation going through these negotiations. Also, make sure you understand the contract. It can be really easy to just have your eyes gloss over and let the university lawyers do everything for you. But at the end of the day, you're the one who has to live with this contract. So make sure you understand it. And if you don't understand it, ask our lawyers to help you understand it because that is their job. Um, and contracting, no matter how many times people say it, people don't believe me. It takes a lot longer to get through contracting than you think. The number of grant proposals that I read where people say that they're going to start developing in Q1 of year one of a grant is hilarious to me because I don't think I've ever seen that actually happen. Because from the minute the clock starts running, it's going to take you at least 3 months to get through contracting. And so to think you're going to be making a lot of movement in that first quarter, maybe you're lucky and you'll get through contracting at the end of that quarter, but it can take a lot longer than you think. And, it's not uncommon for grants that have development built into the timeline for you to start upwards of a year late because it just took that long to get contracting going and then to get mobilized and to get working with your vendor. It can take a very long time. And so again, there's people like me evaluating all of your grants on study sections who have this expertise and experience, and, you'll get hit with your timelines for feasibility if you think you're going to start building in the first quarter. Now, it's not to say that there can't be scenarios where maybe you're already engaged with someone. Well, then, yeah, there can be reasons why it would be expedited. But by and large, it's just going to take a lot longer than you think. And once you get your grant, you're probably already behind on your timeline. Because again, once that clock starts ticking, things move very swiftly in terms of real time, but they still move real slowly in terms of contracting time. And again, this goes back up to the earlier point. Know your contract and understand it. Don't just accept terms because the university says they're okay. Make sure you agree that the terms are okay and that they're terms that you can live with. So those are my lessons learned on contracting. I think I only have one more before we like just really open this up to conversation. But another thing that can really help your relationship with your vendor is to understand the development life cycle. Understand who on your team does what and who on their team does what. Depending on the size of your vendor, you could have a very small team that you're working with. Maybe it's just one or two people. Or you could have a very large development team you're working with. And understanding everyone's roles and responsibilities can help you understand who to talk to for various concerns. Don't be afraid to have a frank discussion about how the design process works with your development team. And changes outside of the cycle can always happen. When people say we can't do that, it's not that we can't do something, it's that it often costs time and money to make changes. And so I think one of the ways that understanding the development life cycle is so critical is it's not uncommon to be working on project teams, particularly with naive, inexperienced um, researchers who've never done this before. And they're not prepared to go into development with their vendor. And so they think, yeah, I know they said it's going to take 1 month to do this. But then when they start bringing in big project changes in week 3 or week 4, there's no way your development's going to be ready on time. So everything comes at a cost. And sometimes it's a cost of time, sometimes it's a cost of money. And if you understand the development life cycle and how the development is going to go sequentially over time, it can help you understand whether the latest, greatest thing you want to introduce really is something that you need right now, or whether it's something that can be tabled for a future version of the product that you're creating. So that's an important thing to understand. And this, yep, this is my last one. Again, time is money. You will have to make a lot of decisions. Decisions about things you don't know about, you don't care about, and you didn't even know were a thing. So be prepared to make a lot of these decisions and be prepared to know who you're going to ask when you don't know the answer. So we can always do something and we can always make changes, but it may take time, and time translates into money. So understanding the roles of people on the team and on the development team and understanding how those two processes work at the simultaneous time can help you understand how better to negotiate these interactions. When I meet with a vendor, I do not have my full project team with me. That would be an unmitigated disaster because my project teams, we often spend a lot of time dithering over little things that the developer could care less about. Like we could have a meeting focused on one or two decisions that need to be made when all of the developer needs to know is the answer to the question. But sometimes we really do need the input of the vendor. So thinking about what should happen in your project team meetings versus what happens in the vendor meetings and who are the right people to have at each of those meetings can save you a lot of time and energy. Too many voices in these meetings can often sabotage progress because, again, we can start to dither on a lot of things. So, knowing when to dither and when to not is also super important because, again, time is money. And every misguided meeting that has the wrong stakeholders there means that you're wasting people's time. And there's only so much time allocated when you're paying people to develop things for you. So I know this is like a giant grab bag of stuff. It probably feels like it's not sequenced together, but I really wanted to spend the rest of the time just having a conversation. So from here, like I've built this as a choose your own adventure. Any of the topics that I talked about are fair game. Some other things that I'm prepared to talk about, helping vendors to understand what it means to work with research teams. That's a huge issue because we are not necessarily like your standard client going to purchase services to build a piece of technology. Sometimes we are, but sometimes we aren't. So we can talk about that. We can talk about how you select a vendor, how you work with vendors to estimate timelines and budget, which is really kind of a circular problem. We can talk about contracting, and we can talk just specifically about how do you work with your vendor. And what that means to me is how do you finish a project still on speaking terms with your vendor? I've got projects where we have had very good relationships with our vendors. We still are on good speaking terms, and we have worked with multiple vendors numerous times. I also have some projects where I could not wait to get away from a developer, and I would never touch that vendor with a 10-foot pole again. So how can we finish our project on speaking terms, I think is totally fair game. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I can put it back up if people want, but what do you guys want to talk about? What can we do?
I have a question to kick off.
Go for it.
So one of the things you said is like understanding the development timeline, but there were several examples throughout your presentation where you said you need to understand, X, Y, and Z, something. What resources at U of M, and I appreciate the call out for Metric and the Mobile Technologies Core, but what other resources would you recommend to investigators to get familiar with if they're going to be hiring a development
I
company?
think the best thing aside from your groups and the like the people that are in place to help negotiate contracts and all of that stuff. Aside from those people that I've talked about, I think the most important thing that you can do is to talk to somebody who's done this before. And better yet, talk to a couple people who have done this before. Find investigators in your area or other staff that have worked with developers and just say, what are your tips and tricks for working with people? Um, because again, like that expertise on a project is so important. And if you don't have it, find it. There are lots of people in your department who can probably tell you about their experiences and their pitfalls. And that in and of itself is so tremendously helpful. And everybody has different experiences with their vendors. If you know somebody who's worked with the vendor you're looking to hire, that can be super beneficial. The other thing that can be really helpful is one of the things that Rima and I have kind of picked up over the years is we have our own in-house departmental IT staff. And we have learned that if we can build them into our grants for like a percent effort, like literally 1%, that can help us understand what we don't know. And when we've got questions about why is our vendor doing this? Why does our vendor want to do something this way as opposed to this way? Having that person who has this expertise and can say, let me tell you what they're having trouble with, that is really beneficial. And I think now that we've started doing that, I would highly recommend especially if you don't have this type of expertise represented on your project team, find it and build it in because it's worth its weight in gold.